Hello and welcome to the fourth session in our Stonyhurst Microsoft Educator Badge course. This session is part of a pair of sessions to do with special educational needs, although that term is actually not mentioned throughout most of the materials. So we're going to begin today with looking at accessibility, which is the foundation for inclusive learning. And the second half of this session is empower every student with an inclusive classroom. But first of all, we're going to look at that foundation. We're halfway through now. You'll notice from the timings from the June 2023 presentation of this course that actually we're, in terms of hours, more than half of the way through, because we've had two 1.5 hour sessions and we just have 2 hour-long sessions left. So today we are going to look at the foundational principles of an accessible learning environment. Accessibility needs to be embedded into the foundation of any learning environment, and when we're using a lot of online tools, we need to know what the technological solutions to some problems are. In some cases, those problems may be created by the use of technology itself, but in the majority of cases, actually the technology solves problems that were pre-existing that simply transfer over to the technology. Then we'll have a look at some Microsoft tools which can support accessibility, and then we'll apply that knowledge to try and work out how we can apply that. And as usual in this course, we consider what we could do immediately with a relatively low workload. So, first of all, if you go to the collaboration space for your cohorts team, please go to accessibility and then to accessibility and inclusion. And then answer this question. You'll be able to see everybody else's responses if you're doing this after the live session. Why is it important to consider accessibility as the foundation of the learning environment? If you pause the video and go and do that, spend 2 or 3 minutes doing that, and then come back and unpause the video. Many of the discussion points that come up in that question are to do with inclusivity being a goal and accessibility the way of achieving that goal. For a while now, our learning support department have been encouraging us with this phrase, quality first teaching. The idea being that we should be looking for interventions later in the process, not for the original access to the knowledge. And in order to think about how we will do this when we are perhaps translating our schemes of work and our resources into digital format or between digital formats, we need to consider what we think of the word ability. If anyone's come across the medical and social models of disability, what I'm about to say is built on that idea, but we're going to try and transfer that to ability in the classroom. And we're not just thinking about special educational needs. We could also be thinking about how particular pupils best access certain types of knowledge, and in a low workload way, trying to increase the number of ways of them accessing the resources which lead them to have the knowledge or skills that we want them to do, without creating multiple banks of resources necessarily. So think of ability like this. Someone is able to do something. Why is that? That's because they have in some way been enabled to do it. And that might be inherent talent, it might be a chance opportunity, it might be privilege, it might be cultural capital or monetary capital. But also teachers, and indeed the whole educational system, can enable things too. So somebody is able to do something because they have been enabled to do it. That means that if somebody is unable to do something, it might be because they have been disabled. And in terms of physical disability, I think we're quite used to this idea. if somebody can't walk downstairs because they've broken their leg, they cannot attend a Microsoft Educator session in Solos Classroom. And if we think of that disability, that broken leg, as a medical matter, then we say that person is disabled by their broken leg. But actually, because we could have enabled that person's access to the classroom or to the session, we could have moved the session to the ground floor, we could install a ramp, we could install a lift. That means they're actually not really disabled by their broken leg. They're disabled by our failure to enable their access. And perhaps failure is a strong term, but if we're going to try and attain the goal of full inclusion, full access to our resources, particularly our digital materials, we need to consider the accessibility so that we can enable everybody to succeed. If we had a colleague who was permanently in a wheelchair, then certainly I wouldn't be running the live sessions downstairs in the music department, because that would mean that I was disabling that person from being able to attain the Microsoft Educator badge. And it was relatively simple to move the classroom perhaps to Xavier and therefore enable that person's success. And we're not here looking at the building a lift, building a ramp, spending lots of money and time solutions. What we're looking at today is the simpler solutions of just taking the material and putting it somewhere else, or delivering it in a slightly different way. Low workload solutions. So there are 5 particular considerations we need to have in mind for accessibility. And we're going to look at the first 3 of those in detail in today's session. So first of all, trying to create a connected learning experience. Second, building systems and structures that reduce barriers and aid organisation. Thirdly, accessing timely data to select meaningful interventions. Fourthly, cultivating lifelong skills that foster greater independence. And fifthly, building a foundation for a personalised learning experience with appropriate hardware. Now, some of those are obviously easier, and some of those are harder and potentially more expensive to put into place. But there are still some what you might call quick wins or low-hanging fruit, things that can be implemented this week, at least on an experimental basis. And what we're really looking for is quality first teaching. This is a very sort of on message Stonyhurst idea. Creating a connected learning experience is really about these 4 things. Making sure that communication is clear, collaboration is part of the work that is being done, that the work is multimodal, and it works across devices. So in terms of communication, in a Stonyhurst context, we're talking about making sure that people know what they're supposed to be doing. That's such a barrier in many cases, and we're not necessarily talking about special educational needs when we say all of these things, though obviously there's a focus there, and some people have references on their IEPs to the ways in which instruction should be presented. But generally, making sure that when an assignment is set on Teams, that it's totally clear what it is the person should be doing and where they should be doing that work, and what they have to do for the teacher to consider it to be finished. And that's absolutely key. Collaboration, having some form of collaboration between students as a regular part of teaching is really important in these contexts, but also ensuring that collaboration between home and school and between the pupils and the educators, and between different teachers and different staff in different roles. So, for example, when you are monitoring boarding supervised study in an evening or supervised study during a day, now on My School Portal, you can actually go to see any pupil's Teams assignments. So if the pupil is telling you that they have no assignments and that's why they're playing Snake or whatever it is, or why they're spending most of their time working out what Spotify playlist they're going to put on to listen to while they pretend to work, actually you can look at their assignment really quickly and say, look, you've got this English that's due tomorrow, why aren't you doing it? And it's a really powerful way of us making sure that pupils are on track. And the tutors can obviously do that as well. Assistant heads, next year playroom leaders will be able to do this in conversations. They can actually see what's being done there. And if you're concerned that a pupil is looking overloaded, you can go and see whether it's appropriate that perhaps you lay off the studies for an evening by looking at what they have to do. We can work together on that. Multimodal, there's a balance to be had with multimodality, because a lot of what we're about to talk about is about reducing the amount of sensory information that is delivered in order to focus really clearly on what needs to be the central point of their learning at that particular moment. But a PowerPoint slide full of text, even if it's following the 6x6 rule that we had in the last session, it still can be a little bit overwhelming, can't it, just to see some text and there's nothing else to stimulate you. When you're looking at the idea of working across devices, of course, in lessons we only have our laptops, but these other three things can also work across devices. So, for example, it could be that you're using Teams notifications because you know that many of your pupils have Teams installed on their phones, and so if you at them in a chat, you know that they're going to receive it. And that works with assignments. If they've got Teams installed on their phone and you set them an assignment, they actually get a notification for that. And there are some other things that cause that as well. That may not be what you're going for, but the idea is that if it's a mechanism that a particular pupil has for making sure they stay on track with deadlines, that you know how to activate that. So if it's a particular pupil has Teams installed on their device and has, their phone on Do Not Disturb or handed in overnight, depending on what playroom they're in, and whether they're a boarder or not, you can know with a reasonable degree of certainty that if you ping them, their phone will ping. And they will see that they've got an assignment, and then they'll do it. Whereas if you didn't, they wouldn't. And that actually is a question of accessibility, helping pupils to be organised. And there are a number of Microsoft tools which help us to make the learning experience more connected. Translator is a really great app. I'll show you in a second. I think we mentioned it in the first session as well, which enables you to have a conversation with somebody in a different language. Now, actually, you probably don't want to have an entire conversation in a different language because they're here to learn English. But actually, if the conversation is not fundamentally about something that needs to happen in English, or you're resorting to the pupil's native language in order, perhaps for a pastoral reason, or to explain a very basic concept that you know they understand but they don't have the language to communicate to you, it can remove some of the frustration around not being able to communicate fully that pupil has, and that might just be a very good access point to get them back into the way of working with everybody else. Forms is a great way of immediately finding out what knowledge people have. and multiple choice questions on forms that can be very quickly marked, and we've looked at those before. Flip and wakelet allow learners to access content and, most importantly, display their understanding through multiple modalities. So rather than it being a case of us providing a stimulus in video and image and then pupils replying in text or by answering multiple choice questions, you can actually do it the other way around, where the stimulus is in text and the response is in another modality. A Teams chat is also an interesting way to empower learners to access support systems. And again, we've looked at this a little bit before, and in the very final session, the sixth video, we're going to look at how to organize teams a bit more. But in the first session, we looked at the idea of open office hours, if you like, on Teams, where there's a channel where pupils can go and ask questions openly, and indeed receive answers to questions that they hadn't asked, because everything's being done in public, essentially an online clinic, so that those who would never go to clinic or even would never ask a question in a Teams chat can read the answers that were put there, or of course watch the video that you gave to the answers, or listen to the audio, or watch the diagram that you drew in a PowerPoint recording. So Teams chat is great because it expands the time at which that information is available, but it also can be multimodal. This is just what Microsoft Translator looks like. It's one of the things that isn't really very useful on the laptop. It's really a phone app, and this is what it looks like on, I think this is an iPhone screen. But it's available on Android as well. And it's really simple. Basically, you and the other person each have half of the screen. And I think I'm right in saying that actually, because these are Microsoft examples, I think I'm right in saying that actually the top one would turn round if you set it up correctly, so that the other person can see it sort of across the table, if you like. And you speak, and it reads it out to them in their language, just like an interpreter would do. The next thing for us to look at is independent learning. So we're trying to create an independent learning experience. And again, this is not just about people who have an SEN. It's for everybody, but it particularly may help people with a specific learning difficulty where there are adjustments that will need to be made to them throughout their lives, because increasingly as they go through their lives they will need to make those adjustments or seek those adjustments themselves. And in some cases that'll be a case of coping strategies, in some cases it'll be equipment or strategies for approaching particular tasks. But actually accessibility, remembering the analogy with physical accessibility, going down some stairs if you've broken your leg, in an ideal world is ensuring that somebody has the opportunity without having to ask assistance from another person. So without having to go to learning support and say, can you help me with this, miss? Without having to come back to you and say, miss, can I talk to you about something I didn't understand in class, in a clinic setting, but to enable them to do that for themselves. So it has to be accessible in real time, non-stigmatizing, and as close to their peers' experience as possible. In terms of helping pupils to organize themselves, these four tools are absolutely key. And I think three of them we're really familiar with, and the fourth I'm just at the time of saying this in June 2023 starting to get to grips with and how it works. So Teams, we're in there, we're all in Teams, that's where our classes are. There are also some other groups in there, a few co-curricular groups in there, some whole playroom groups, those kind of things. We also got OneNote, which is our folder. We've already had a session on that. Assignments, we're not covering in this Microsoft Educator badge, but we all get trained in it when we arrive at Stonyhurst, and we had in September 2022 a really big push on that, and I think it's worked superbly when it's done well. The fourth one is Planner, and if you just Google Microsoft Planner and log in with your Stonyhurst email address, you can have a bit of a play with it. Essentially, what it allows you to do is it's a to-do list where you can assign elements of that to-do list to other people, and you find out when they've done it. And it reminds them at certain intervals by email that they've got things to do. So it's a little bit like an off-book assignments. And for particular individuals, it may be useful for the tutor to engage with Planner for that pupil in order for the pupil to set some milestone targets. Or it may be that you've got some pupils who are seeing a coursework deadline in 4 or 5 weeks' time and need some staging towards that, but you want to do it outside assignments. The advantage of assignments is that they see it really clearly in amongst all of their work. But of course, if you're setting them 7 deadlines over 7 weeks, that can look a bit overwhelming in their assignments. It's a bit better now than it was at the beginning of this academic year, because it's now split out into by date. But Planner can be something that actually reminds them by email occasionally. I'm saying this simply because Microsoft mentioned it in their training on this, and I have used it a little bit for actually for departmental admin more than, well, entirely for departmental admin, and not at all for anything pupil facing. And I'm not entirely sure I've worked out exactly how to best use it. But it is true that with our reports for this term, we now as a department get our emails once every couple of days reminding us what the deadlines are, and they don't have to come from Mark Evans, they come from Microsoft, and that keeps us on track, I would say. And this is what Planner looks like. So on the left-hand side here, this is what we put in. We put in the different deadlines that were there, including I've allocated one to Matt, and then this is the email that I kept. This is the email I got 5:01 this morning. I didn't read it at 5:01 this morning. It just reminds me what I've got coming up in that particular plan. We're now going to talk about cognitive load theory, and this is really the most important thing to focus on, I would say, in this session, because what overall we're trying to do is reduce the cognitive load, which is the mental effort exerted to complete a task, to the minimum that it needs to be in order to complete the task, which enables the person to gain the learning. So let's have a look at this diagram. Here at number 1, the information comes in. In box 2, it's gone into the sensory memory. So we've sensed this information. Some of that is forgotten. Some of it goes into the working memory. At that point, some of it is forgotten. Then we rehearse it. So this is retrieval practice, or some kind of activity that's designed to keep the relevant knowledge in working memory. I say relevant knowledge in working memory. That's why if you have too many instructions, actually what you remember is the instructions and not the knowledge that you were trying to do with the task, because the instructions were so complicated. And some of that is encoded into long-term memory and then can be retrieved from long-term memory. So that's the cycle 3, 8, 4, 9. Okay. How a task is designed and presented impacts your ability, and I mean your as well as everybody else's ability, to move information from working to long-term memory. So, how can we increase accessibility? By decreasing unnecessary sensory stimulus and also removing what is a bit of a modern buzzword, by removing busy work. That is the kind of work that makes us look busy but actually isn't achieving anything. Well, first of all, I could have presented the diagram like this. There's no different content here. to what there was in the first diagram, but rather than having the labels down the side and having to do busy work of looking down to 1 to find out where it was, looking down to 2 to find out what it was, it's just there immediately on the diagram. The fact that numbers 4 and 7, forgotten and forgotten, are now clearly a pair makes a bit more sense of why they're both downward arrows, and it just is easier to get hold of. I almost don't need to talk through that diagram, which means that somebody doesn't need to listen to me talking through it. They can work it out for themselves much more quickly. That's perhaps a slightly childish demonstration, but I think it's quite a helpful way of thinking of a cognitive load, is to actually look at the cognitive load diagram in its least well presented form, and then seeing immediately how it could be better presented and how it's immediately much clearer. I've also made it bigger because of the diagram coming from a site on the internet. It's actually therefore made it a little bit pixelated and harder to read, but you can see how the size of it is also really important, particularly if you're watching this on a laptop screen sort of 4 or 5 feet away. You probably have to lean over or move the laptop or squint, whereas this one is probably totally clear to you from whatever distance. So there are a couple of ways in which we can lessen the cognitive load, I should say load at the top, not mode, by increasing focus. So there is in Word, for example, literally something called focus mode, which is great. So it's on the view menu, you click on focus mode. This is something that you could do if you're presenting something to a class, or if you're recording something on PowerPoint Recorder to show to a class, but it's also something you can encourage your pupils to do. If they're working in Word, they can actually remove all of the menus and just type or read. The view menu, click focus mode, and it looks like this. That's the whole screen. I haven't cropped this. That's entirely what it looks like. Okay, they just see the text. And it's wonderful. You can actually buy word processors for a couple of £100 that just do this, that don't give you anything else, and I think why waste the £200 when you can already do it with Word. Another way of lessening cognitive load is using speech to text. So if somebody finds it difficult, for example, to read, they can, and the task you're setting them doesn't actually rely on them reading it for themselves, or perhaps they have a reader in an exam. You can, on the review menu, you can use read aloud. Really interesting that it's on the review menu, because actually it is a brilliant way of proofreading things. So it's not necessarily we're just talking about people who might have difficulty reading things and you want to give them another way of accessing the content without you having to record it for them or something, or give them somebody to read it out to them. It's a really good way of getting people to proofread things, and indeed proofreading things yourself. I did this with my entire master's thesis. I read it aloud section by section over several nights, and I caught so many errors that way. Now, with my social science background, this is one of those moments where I have to say I'm slightly uncomfortable with Microsoft's use of a particular word, and this particular case is data. A lot of data is gathered by Microsoft tools, and it often shows you that data and says, well, look, this is really interesting, isn't it? That's not really a totally robust way of dealing with data and analysing data. Just highlighting stuff that appears to be interesting from the data you happened to have gathered is not really the way forward. You're supposed to decide what data you want to collect, then collect it, and then analyse it. But as long as you're aware of all of those caveats, that it's not you who's decided what to collect or how to analyse it, and you can just say that could be interesting, and you don't go too hot and heavy with any actions you base on them, then actually there's a a lot to be said for looking at these three tools: insights, forms, and reading progress. So first of all, insights. This is in every class team. This one is the June 2023 Microsoft Educator class team, and we can see that of the 17 students, 7 of them did not visit the team at all last week. So that's probably the people who are working online and watching these videos, so I'm not having a go at you too much, because you're not actually in the team. You're perhaps using the OneNote outside the team, and you're using the YouTube videos. Fine. Over here on habits, there are actually 2 cards here. This one says that a particular member of staff, student in this case, often works late at night. The next card said that somebody often works late in the morning when they're on this team. So there we go. This card is to do with assignments. I set a test assignment and none of you handed it in. That's probably because it's called Ignore This. And then there's another overview card about work habits there. So what I mean by not being too hot and heavy about the use of this data is actually, if you go to these 7 students and you say, you were inactive last week, why did you not go to the team? Well, it could be that they accessed the materials through OneNote, and actually they did quite a lot of work, but that's not recorded in Teams. Okay. The second tool that we're going to look at is forms, and forms is really good for gathering a quick impression of how a group of pupils are doing, and then being able to go down to individual responses. So this particular question is one of many on this form. Pupils have listened to an audio extract which is available for them at the beginning of the form. They've answered these questions. The correct answer to the instruments is either tuba or bass trombone, and you can see that actually where somebody's written tuba, it's been automatically graded as correct because I already wrote in that the answer was tuba or bass trombone. But where somebody got it wrong, they get told they've got it wrong, and they get told what the correct answer is. And here I'm actually doing this anonymously. I could be putting this on the screen in front of the class to help them understand that in this particular case it had to be bass trombone or tuba and not violin, for whatever reason I then explained to them as a group. And it's anonymized. None of the pupils' names are there. Of course they know what they put, but they don't have to say that out loud. Though when they've got bass trombone correct, they're quite happy with it, with shouting it out. And the third tool, one which I think is much less used and perhaps less useful in our 13 to 18 context, is reading progress, where you can set a reading progress assignment. It's one of the options under Create Assignment. Actually you get somebody to read something out, and it marks the number of words per minute. It marks their accuracy, showing you how many mispronunciations they have, omissions, self-corrections, insertions, repetitions, based on a text that you give to them. I wonder how useful this is, as I said, in a 13 to 18 context, but if you were in a situation where you needed to set a reading homework, a reading set of studies rather, and you wanted to make sure that particular pupils had in fact read it, you should get them to read a portion of it out loud, potentially, just to actually check that they had done it, alongside a quiz to check that they'd understood the content. So here is our second pausing the video moment. What will you implement this week to increase the accessibility of a task or resource? This is in your own folder, so if you hop over to OneNote now, pause the video and answer that question. There are a couple of ideas there for you to think about. And that's it for this session, really. So in order to redeem your achievement code, do the normal thing. You head over to learn.microsoft.com, you sign in with your Stonyhurst email address, you click on your name or face in the top right hand corner, click on Profile, click on Achievements, click on Redeem Your Code Now, and then here's the session, QRYRGZ, and then you can go back to Activity and check that it's appeared there. And that's it then for accessibility as the foundation of inclusivity. If you want to move on straight away to the second video of this third session, you're very welcome to. It ties in very closely with what we've just done. And then the fourth video will be on, so the sixth video of the fourth session will be on structuring teams. Thank you very much for watching.